This is Movietone. Leslie Mitchell reporting. Excellent news has been coming from every front lately, but special interest for us in Britain is naturally reserved for reports of Allied success in France. Members of the Russian military mission, which recently visited Normandy, were first shown how and where our bridgehead was secured, with emphasis on the work of airborne troops. From General Dempsey, commanding the Second Army, they received the latest intelligence of the situation in his sector. Leaders prominently concerned with the latest operations by United Kingdom and Canadian forces are seen at a recent conference. Monty and Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh Mallory, Air Marshals Broadhurst and Coningham, and on the left General Crerar commanding the Canadian Army. Some of the Allied leaders in France making the Hun dance to their tune. Very important advances have since been made all the way from the hinge of the Allied line, south of Caen, to the distant battlefield in Brittany. The Canadians and their comrades from the old country have been pushing the enemy back in spite of the most fierce and stubborn resistance. One of our latest film dispatches from this sector shows the Guards advancing to clear the Germans out of a defensive position they'd been ordered to hold at all costs. The Guards cleared them out, and one more piece of French soil was cleansed of what Mr. Churchill called the filthy pollution of the Hun. Almost the whole front was on the move by now, and in many places the pace was very hot indeed. South and east, the Allies streamed through the breaches made in the Hun's lines. The German plan to contain the lodgement area in France had been smashed to pieces. Villers Bocage, which had been one of the toughest nuts to crack, was ours. A ruined town, but an important position. The Hun had fled, leaving countless mines behind him, and our flail tanks were hard at work. The Hun had left something else behind him, a great mass of equipment. Tanks, vehicles and guns, vital equipment of every kind. Some of it simply abandoned in his hurry to get away, but most of it smashed by our own tanks, our own artillery, our infantry and our typhoons. Very heavy losses, which Hitler's generals, those of them he doesn't hang that is, can most certainly not afford to lose. These were von Kluge's. How can he hope to replace them in sufficient quantity and in time? At last, Hitler is being beaten in the field on every front, and his weapons that were to conquer the world, his weapons of destruction, are themselves being destroyed wholesale. And what about his fighting men? They were being rounded up by the thousand. The Americans' high-speed blitz in Brittany was accounting for enormous numbers. Back they went, many of them piled into trucks for dispatch overseas. And as the Americans swept on to St. Malo, Brest, Lorient, St. Nazaire, Brittany itself became a camp of German prisoners. They gave themselves up literally by the thousand. Sometimes with hardly any escort, often without any escort whatsoever. They slugged their way back till they found someone to take charge of them. Often the Americans couldn't send a guard with them, and the speed of the advance was such that they hadn't time to bother about escorts. Anyway, these Huns were glad enough to surrender. Obediently, they went where they were told. After all, the Russians were almost on German soil in the east. The Americans were flooding through all Brittany. Hitler was hanging generals at home. So surrender was obviously the only secret weapon they had. In fact, a Bavarian is reported to have described his white flag as V5. I will never capitulate, says Hitler. In Brittany, it began to look as if he was the only Hun that wouldn't. All through Brittany, the Americans swept on. Opposition awaited them at some of the ports, but their progress towards these was at the speed of a super blitz. French men and women in the villages through which they passed could scarcely believe it at first. Then, well, they were decidedly expressive. When the city of Rennes was liberated, amazing scenes were witnessed. Scenes of joy at the return of long-lost freedom, scenes of welcome for the liberating troops. And as you'll see in a moment, scenes of implacable, long-repressed hatred for the Boche and all who worked with them. We in Britain haven't suffered nearly 5 years of German occupation. Our trials have been great, but they've been different. And we can scarcely imagine how these French people must have felt at such a moment. It was on the evening of the day that Rennes was set free that the rounding up of men and women collaborationists took place. Watch for the last man to be led out, a man who had worked hand and glove with the Nazis, a man responsible for the death of 10 Frenchmen only 4 days earlier. Here he comes. He got off with a broken nose and a broken arm, but he faces trial and presumably death for his treachery and treason. Now at last, Rennes was rid of him and the rest of his pals. Rid of the Boche at last. The end of the war itself can scarcely bring such scenes of joy to Rennes as this day of liberation. In Rennes, freedom has been restored. Throughout all occupied Europe, freedom is in sight, but German power is fading fast. Yes, the news from the west as well as from the east is not too bad.